The Russians, other than adding more poorly trained infantry, I think they are at their limit.
The Russians are an adaptive army. They might have been a very bad army.
I don't understand why the administration is reluctant to provide the Great Eagle drone.
Hello, I'm Bill Browder, and welcome to the show where we delve into the mind of Vladimir Putin. In this series, I'll be speaking to the people who know his story, who've lived the consequences of his actions, and who understand how he works. This is Inside Putin's Mind. I'm Bill Browder. In this episode, we're going to be asking the question, what weapons will Putin use next as we delve into the war and see how Ukraine can stop Russia? But first, here's everything you need to know about the weaponry of war so far.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine has put the capabilities of modern warfare on the world stage. So what weapons are being used in Ukraine? The cluster bomb. The cluster bomb has a hollow shell with thousands of smaller bombs inside. These bombs scatter small bomblets over a wide area, which can result in a significant number of casualties. Russia has outfitted its cluster bombs with small parachutes in order to facilitate attacks at a lower altitude, meaning their pilots can escape. They've also been using cluster bombs on civilian areas in order to kill as many people as possible. Vacuum bombs. Also called thermobaric weapons, these are one of the most brutal war weapons. The bombs are filled with explosive and chemical mix, which causes supersonic blast waves obliterating anything in their path on explosion. They are referred to as vacuum bombs because they suck in the oxygen from the surrounding air to generate a powerful explosion. Bayraktar TB2 drone. Remote-controlled drones mean pilots no longer have to risk their lives. This drone is capable of staying at a medium altitude for long durations and can travel up to 224 kilometers per hour. The Bayraktar TB2 can also be armed with 4 laser-guided bombs. SIG MCX semi-automatic rifle. Capable of shooting over 800 rounds per minute at targets over 500 meters away. The main reason this weapon was chosen by the Ukrainian Special Forces is because of its stealth. It's so quiet with the suppressor, the Russians can't even locate where they are being shot from. 9K-720 Iskander ballistic missile. These missiles have destroyed homes, hospitals and schools in many Ukrainian cities and have a range of 500 kilometers. This missile can also carry nuclear warheads. NLAW anti-tank weapon. Weighing just 12.5 kilograms, NLAW is a portable, shoulder-launch system that can be used by a single operator. It can destroy a heavily protected modern battle tank with one shot at a range of 800 meters. T-90 Russian tank. Russia counts the T-90 as among its best battle tanks. Its top speed is 60 kilometers per hour, and it's operated by 3 soldiers. Despite being one of the war's most dangerous weapons, the Russians have lost at least 50 T-90 tanks since the war began.
I'm now joined by Major General Chip Chapman, a previous guest on this show. Welcome back on the show.
Thank you, Bill.
So when this war first started, I looked at these charts, and the charts were like, on one side, here's the Russian arsenal, tanks and planes and all this kind of stuff. And on the other side was Ukraine, and it looked just terrible for Ukraine. What's changed since that chart was first produced?
Well, there are 2 parts to war. There's a physical part, which can be measured just in terms of metrics of how much you have of X and Y. And there's a psychological part, which may not. So it's not just better weapons, better food. It's really whoever inspires and whatever inspires, that is the key thing at the end of the day. And one of the big mistakes, or 3 mistakes really, that Putin made were, firstly, he thought the Russian army was better than it was. Secondly, he thought the Ukrainian army was worse than it was. And thirdly, he thought the West was fractured, particularly after the withdrawal from Ukraine. All of those were wrong, but what I was looking at the time really was comments from Mark Milley in 2019 when he became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, Mark Milley, I know, I did my final course on strategy in the army with Mark Milley, and there were 5 myths which he said we need to let go. Some of these are absolutely relevant to the current conflict. The first one, wars might be short. Wars will be short, they might not. The second one, armies fight wars. They don't. Nations fight wars. The third one, armies are easy to create. They're not, and the Russians are finding that in the way that the Ukrainians, who'd been trained and training for this really since the 2014 Crimea invasion, had sealed the difference between what they were in 2014 and what they were like in 2022.
So we have this this situation where I remember watching the traffic jams of tanks, and then watching the Ukrainians with whatever shoulder-propelled missiles, basically taking away the entire advantage of these tanks with these shoulder-propelled. What did you call them?
Well, they were Javelin anti-tank missiles.
Javelin anti-tank missiles. And so it didn't matter whether they had 14,000 or none, because everyone who was sitting in one of those tanks was basically burnt to a crisp. And one of the things I've been wondering as all these discussions now are centering on tanks is, why is it such an advantage now for the Ukrainians to have these Abrams tanks or these Leopard tanks from Germany? What's different about that for the Ukrainians than this whole death box from Javelin that we watched?
Well, firstly, by itself, it isn't. Now, they reckon that on one basis against, for example, a Russian T-72 versus a Leopard 2 or a Challenger, you have a 2.4 to 4 advantage. That is, that quantum is the same as the difference between a Tiger tank and a Sherman in the Second World War. So 4 Shermans would be needed to take out a Tiger tank. So there's a huge difference in mobility, firepower and protection of a Western tank from a Russian tank. But it's not the tanks by themselves. Using tanks by themselves is a recipe for disaster. If they're isolated, then you get the situation when, if your mobility goes on one maneuver corridor, essentially a road for the Russians, you're a sitting target. Yep. That's why the anti-tank missiles were so effective. So it is absolutely the need to have this combined arms capability of all the arms of the armour, the tanks, the mechanised infantry, the air defence, the engineers and the artillery working together, hopefully with the air, which gives you the best chance of success. But they can lead you to go through the point of weakness in the Russian lines, which you need to identify. And then what people don't understand really is that the psychological part is really a powerful thing. So that leads, if you can break through to what we call an expanding torrent, go deep, go behind the lines, sever the logistics, that really paralyzes people's minds. And it's not about reductionism per se, killing X or Y or Z. It's destroying the will to resist. And that's what generalship is really all about.
So similarly, we've started to supply the Ukrainians with these long-range missiles, HIMARS, which, as I understand it, as a non-military guy, Ukrainians have longer range than the Russians. So they can stand back behind, the point where they can be bombed, send them over and knock out different Russian installations. And as I understand, the U.S. gave the Ukrainians even longer range missiles. Is that going to be enough to disrupt all sorts of stuff that the Russians were thinking as having a big advantage on?
It will. You have to first go back to say that HIMARS is actually the delivery system. The rockets are different. Right. So that's the difference between the ATACMS, the range of an ATACMS, and the range of a ground-launched missile. So the difference between a sort of 70K missile and the ATACMS as a 300-kilometer missile. But what those will do is, the Russians are an adaptive army. They might have been a very bad army. Now they're probably just a bad army. But the anecdotal evidence from what's going on in Bakhmut, particularly with the Russian army now sort of taking primus inter pares from the Wagner group, is that their efficiency and coordination between air power, artillery and maneuver is getting better. Their logistics also have been moved to a position where the HIMARS launchers can't take them out. So if you have a longer range missile, the difference between a 70 or 90K delivered from the HIMARS at the moment to 150K, that pushes their logistics further back or degrades them because they're taken out with precision strike. That also means that the tempo of operations is reduced because you need logistics forward to have an operational breakthrough. Otherwise, you're going to do what we call culminate. You run out of offensive power and have to go on the defensive. And essentially, that's what the Russians have done in all their operations from last February.
So do you think that these, I think it's 150,000 or 150K, is that going to make a difference?
It will make a difference because it puts everything in eastern Ukraine in range, all the logistics of the Russians, and it also brings Crimea into range. Now, really, Crimea is the prize.
So the other big thing that everybody talks about is the number of troops. So Russia's a big country. They've got a population of 141 million people. You can't believe a word they say, but they claim that they drafted, 500,000 people recently, and they're going to do another 500,000, possibly, probably. How does that feed into the whole thing?
Well, we have to be slightly circumspect on that because we're not really sure that the Russian force generation model, which is not just people, but it's the fact that you need to equip them, you need to feed them, you need to really give them armored mobility, you need to give them tanks. Unless they have that, then manpower or women power, because the Ukrainians certainly are using a lot of women in the forces, per se doesn't give you an advantage. If they're just going to be fed into a meat grinder, then actually that might fracture Russian societies. So it's not necessarily a good thing that the Russians think that they can mobilize that amount of people, another 500,000 in the future, and it could actually blow back onto Putin and lead those sort of fractures in society, which are also dangerous for him in the future.
What should we be, the population, be demanding of our leaders to provide, which hasn't been provided, which could change the balance of power in this war?
Well, there are. So, for example, from a UK perspective, there's a thing called Storm Shadow, which would give, is a cruise missile with a 550-mile range. Now, that, as we saw with the sovereignty issue over Leopard tanks, is an Anglo-French system. So you would need agreement from both the Allies, and there may be some parts from Italy. So again, you would need, for sovereign reasons, all three nations to agree to that. There are also those sort of cruise missiles which the Americans could give with very long range as well. Those would be, of course, things which would reach into Russia. Now, from a military perspective, and they're already doing operations in Russia, in Belgorod province, the Ukrainians need to be able to fight a deep battle, that is, to sever the front line from the rear areas. If they can do that with their own indigenous productions, and again, there are a lot of contracts signed between Western countries and the Ukrainians for production of some clever capabilities. So that's probably the better way to go if there's a reticence from politicians in the West who don't want to go up what they perceive to be a escalation risk sort of ladder, which I don't agree with, because the threat really comes from an escalation from a Russian perspective, not from a Western perspective.
Other than jets, which I think we both agree should be provided, is there any other category of military hardware which exists that's not on the table that should be on the table?
Well, the only other element we haven't really discussed is the maritime flank. Now, inconveniently for the Russians, of course, they're really a continental power with two inconvenient coastlines to the north and south, which frequently freeze in the winter. If you can make a statement again, like they did with the sinking of the Moskva, and take out some more of their maritime capability, particularly around Sevastopol, that again would also shatter the illusion, because it's in Crimea, that the Russians haven't got a price to pay for what they're doing.
Well, we really appreciate your expertise on this show. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Bill.
We're now going to hear from retired Army Lieutenant General Ben Hodges on some of the weapons being used in the war in Ukraine.
The delivery of Western-made tanks, British Challenger, German Leopard, American Abrams, is important for three reasons. Number one, it signifies that the West recognizes that we can go to the next level of aid without really fearing Russian escalation. We finally are realizing that the Russians actually cannot escalate, even though they talk about it. Secondly, this gives particularly the Challenger and the German Leopards, all of which will be in Ukrainian hands much sooner. It gives them real capability that will enable them to penetrate Russian defenses sometime this spring as part of the next Ukrainian counteroffensive, ideally to sever the so-called land bridge, which connects Crimea to Russia along the Sea of Azov coastline. That's an essential part of isolating Crimea. And then the third reason, of course, the United States to provide Abrams, I think also perhaps could be part of a much longer term support by the United States and investment in Ukraine. But UK has frequently been the first to provide certain capabilities. The NLAW is a very, very effective anti-tank system. It's quick. The Ukrainians were quick to learn how to use it and to employ it properly and effectively. So I think this would play a key role in the early days of stopping Russia's initial attacks towards Kyiv. The capability that Ukraine needs more than anything is long-range precision strike, whether that's delivered by an aircraft or a rocket or a drone. They need the ability to hit Russian headquarters, Russian transportation, Russian ammunition sites at great distance, further than 100 kilometers. That's the capability they need to defeat Russian mass, and that's also the capability they need to make Crimea untenable. The last Ramstein contact group, there was a package that included what's called ground-launched small diameter bomb, which has a range of 150 kilometers, so 90 miles. That's a significant capability. The problem is that it's going to be several months before that arrives, so they don't actually have it yet. I think I don't understand why the administration is reluctant to provide the Great Eagle drone. I think all the questions and excuses have been answered effectively, but they still are not willing to do that yet. That would really be significant. A 25-hour loiter time, carries Hellfire missiles. That would be very effective against headquarters, ammunition storage, critical transportation nodes. I don't understand why we haven't provided that. ATACMS, that's the rocket fired from HIMARS that has a range of 300 kilometers or 180 miles. That would be a real significant improvement because the Ukrainians could be hitting Sevastopol today, forcing the Russian Navy to have to evacuate that place. I think there's a concern here that we don't have enough. I mean, if the United States gets into a conflict with China, I mean, the ATACMS would be an important weapon system or ordnance. So I think that's a concern. I hope nonetheless that we will find a way to provide some to Ukraine. F-16s or other type aircraft, I don't know. It would take about 4 to 5 months to take a Ukrainian pilot who already is experienced in his aircraft. I think in about 4 months, that pilot could be very proficient in a F-16, for example, which is really fast compared to what normal training time would be. The Russians, other than adding more poorly trained infantry, I think they are at their limit. I don't know that there's anything else they have or that they can do. Sanctions have limited their ability to replenish their expended precision weapons. The quality of the weapons that they're launching now is decreasing. The Ukrainians are able to knock down typically more than 60 or 70% of the various types of rockets and missiles and drones that the Russians are launching against civilian targets. They're not getting the effect from those things that probably they were hoping to get. So I don't want to say I don't fear them. I live here in Frankfurt, but what I mean is I don't see those as having significant impact. Same thing with their armored forces, their artillery. They have used up a lot of ammunition, but I assume they have endless amounts of artillery ammunition, but still, it's older. It's not as effective as it was. It's even dangerous to the user. And they don't have trained crews and organizations that are able to employ what they do have. So I don't think there's a new thing out there that's going to make a big difference for Russia. Clearly, they are willing to expend thousands of lives, pushing them into the meat grinder in hopes of overwhelming Ukrainian defenses.
So do the Ukrainians have the weapons to win this war? It sounds like we're getting close to the point where they do. Yes, the Ukrainians need jets. Yes, they could have longer range artillery. Yes, they could have more tanks. But they're now in a position, using intelligence, using willpower, and using motivation, to use the weapons that they have to really cause great trouble for the Russians. As we've discussed, the Russians, of course, have a lot of soldiers. They have a lot of weapons of their own. But because of the Western support, because of the technology that the Ukrainians are getting, it does put them in a position where they can certainly defend their territory and hopefully drive the Russians back further. My thanks to all my guests, Major General Chip Chapman and Ben Hodges. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the mind of Vladimir Putin.